The debate over gun violence, rights, and mental health erupted again after last month's tragic shooting at a Catholic school in Minneapolis.
Communities across the nation have felt the impact, and our next guest brings a unique perspective. In his new book, 1,000 Ways to Die, The True Cost of Violence on Black Life in America, author Trymaine Lee explores the generational impact of guns on the Black experience in America. Joining us now to dive deeper is author and Pulitzer Prize winner and Emmy Award-winning journalist Trymaine Lee. Welcome, Trymaine.
Thank you for having me, Lindsay. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so Trymaine, I wanted to start with just you being a journalist and stepping back to around 2019 to 2021 time. I remember I was reporting the news about Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, George Floyd. And after the third incident within a few months, I remember crying on air. And I know that as a traditional journalist, it must be hard to try to navigate both reporting the incidents, but also being so deeply involved in some traumatic incidents that you've been covering over the years. So how do you balance both and make sure to tell the story, but also, I guess, lead with empathy when it's necessary?
I'll be honest with you, Lindsay. It took me a very long time to find that balance, especially in my younger years as a reporter. I would arrive at crime scenes and find young men and women who look just like me from communities like mine. And I'd see the pain in their families' eyes. And in that pain, I'd see my own families. And so telling these stories time and again, we try to rely on, the journalistic impulse to be arm's length from, the people whose stories you're telling. But it gets difficult, especially when you understand deeply the pain that individuals and neighbors and whole communities are going through. I've learned over the years that you have to process it in real time. You have to identify when it's impacting you in a certain way, because quite frankly, we don't name it trauma, but it's trauma. Often secondary trauma, but it's trauma nonetheless. And so for me, especially during those years you talked about, but for me going back even a little earlier, from Trayvon Martin in 2012 and Mike Brown in 2014 in Ferguson and Eric Garner, right? And the list goes on, and Breonna Taylor you mentioned. It's not easy. And especially for those of us who are mission driven as journalists, who want to shine light in the dark places, want to speak to how we live and die in this country, want to speak to the machinery and the cogs that grind us sometimes. But sometimes I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize how the coverage itself is grinding and wearing on us as individuals and reporters.
All the incidents both of you have mentioned so far, these are incidents of police abuse against Black people. Your book is called 1,000 Ways to Die. Are you exploring the connection between police action and violence against Black people specifically, or 1,000 ways implies looking at a numerous or myriad causes of violence in the Black community?
In all honesty, the police violence, which gets the headlines and is, certainly, we feel the weight of that kind of carceral abuse, but from that system. But most of it is about the white supremacist kind of violence, and also the violence of community that spurs as a response to how Black folks have been cordoned off and disinvested in our communities. And so while I touch on the police violence, certainly it goes much deeper than that. In this story, I tell my own family story going back 100 years to the Jim Crow South, where Black folks in this country first began to experience the heft of violence that this country would heap upon us. From slave codes and Jim Crow and the fall of Reconstruction, and that period that a lot of folks forget about called redemption, that after the federal troops left the South in 1877, really making sure that Black folks could experience their citizenship peacefully, a wave of white supremacist violence set in. And I think the trauma from which and the residue from which we've continued to carry on generation by generation until we join the Great Migration and we're in Baltimore and Los Angeles and Detroit and Philadelphia and New York and experience a systemic kind of violence from being segregated and redlined to the experience of community violence, neighborhood violence, where folks who don't have access to quality health care or education or food access, right, turn the violence of the system onto their neighbors and themselves. And so 1,000 Ways to Die speaks directly to that idea, that it's more than just the violence of the bullet. It's the violence of the system, but it's more than just the bullets from police officers' guns. It's the bullets from your neighbor's gun. It's the bullets that kill folks in supermarkets in Buffalo, or churches in South Carolina, or synagogues, and all the places, the public places in which people are killed in this country, specifically through the lens of how Black people in this country have experienced it.
Now, Trymaine, you talk about the systemic issues within your book, but also I want to talk about some relevant news right now, like what the president is considering doing in Chicago, what he's already done in D.C., what he's talking about doing possibly in Baltimore. When you see some of these cities that have a large Black population that obviously have systemic issues ingrained within them to why people have certain outcomes, do you think there's a place like, Governor Wes Moore said, where you can have a correlation between the federal government to make them come in and help out populations of people of color so their outcomes are more positive in some of these inner cities?
Lindsay, I want to refer back to something I said a minute ago, and the irony is not lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on any of us, that a lot of Black folks ended up in Baltimore and Chicago because, as I mentioned, the federal troops in 1877, and part of a political compromise, left the South and left white supremacists to their own devices. And so in the generations and decades to follow, Black folks fled the South, seeking new opportunities in new cities. And it's interesting to me that all these years later, that the federal government is threatening to send troops into these cities, not to protect, but to occupy and possibly inflict more harm. And so I think there is also a default position of anti-Blackness in this country that allows this to flourish. Lest we forget the president's own words just in recent days, that people in these communities were born to be criminal, that there is some sort of genetic defect that makes Black people innately violent and criminal, and thus allowing folks to say, you know what, maybe they do need federal troops there, and let's give it a try. Understanding the potential violence, but also the violence of that kind of incursion and the violence of the rhetoric built around, what will likely help grease the wheels for that kind of action to happen.
I mean, you say not being sent to protect, but certainly you can disbelieve, I guess, the Trump administration when they say that's what the goal is. We're here in D.C. where the National Guard was deployed. There were tons of arrests. The largest category of arrests during this last few weeks, the National Guard was here, was for illegal handgun possessions. And now I'm a libertarian, so I don't love to confiscate guns from people. But if you're concerned about crime or crime in Black communities is impacted here by DC, it's usually illegal handguns are what is involved. If you want to have less guns in circulation on some level, you need the police or the National Guard or law enforcement, whoever it is. They need to be stopping people, arresting people, and confiscating illegal guns. And that would make cities safer. Now, we may not want to do that for a variety of civil liberties means, but if you are, particularly concerned about the impact of gun violence on minority communities, isn't that, what is the solution but to have the police or the National Guard arrest people for possessing illegal handguns and taking them away?
By the time you get to the interaction between, police and people with guns, you already lost the game, right? And so certainly in DC, I think that you will see some crimes of opportunity drop because of that presence. But think about what we've seen in the last week or two. We've all seen the video of, military blowing up an alleged, boat carrying narcotics from Venezuela in international waters. If we really cared about gun violence in this country and illegal guns, why wouldn't we stem it from where it starts? Almost every single gun in this country used in a crime started legally. We know the factories that are pumping them out. We know the retail market and the wholesale market. And then there's this super loose secondary market. And then there's the gun show market, right? And then there's in some places, you can sell it out the back of the trunk of your car kind of market. If we really cared about the flow of guns, we'd reevaluate this idea of the good guys with guns and the bad guys with guns. Because guess what? A lot of the so-called good guys are also illegally selling guns under the guise of their federal authority to have gun shops, right? So if we want to target the guns, need to target it long before it gets to a young man. But certainly no one, I think, would deny that we need greater accountability. And there are a lot of guns in the hands of folks who should not have them. But again, if you care about not just getting guns off the street, if you care about protecting those lives of people most impacted, you can't cast a wide net and say those victims, they're also born to be criminal. You can't. And there's another saying, and it's almost cliche, when they say nothing stops a bullet like a paycheck. There should be no surprise that where we see the most violence, right, community violence, it's those places that experience the most hunger, right? The ones that have the lowest income, the lowest wealth. That gap is super wide between those who have and who have not. And so there are many ways to target gun violence, but the violence of the trigger is always preceded by the systemic violence.
Now, Trymaine, in your book, you talk about your great uncle being killed not that long ago in a sundown town in 1923. And I think that's so relevant right now as we talk about coming from the president taking away or the history of this country, the Smithsonian African American Museum being too negative, too enforcing on slavery and some of those horrific instances that happen all over the South and throughout the country, honestly. What's your perspective on balancing and keeping stories alive like your great uncles, but also an active attempt at kind of sifting through what is historically noted in certain cities, including Philadelphia, which I know is very close to your heart? They're combing through some exhibits there to talk that specifically discuss slavery and brutal actions that happened thereafter.
I think that's one of the most obscene aspects of this whole conversation. It's that Black people, since we've been here, have been defined by the violence heaped upon us by others. And so that the Black history is, the violence that we've endured, when Black history could also be viewed as what we survived. And I think by trying to carve away certain uglier parts, because people, and I'll say society, American society, white American society, they don't want to really have to embrace the violence that this country has delivered to Black folks time and again. And so, as long as we can take America's credits without having to acknowledge its debits, you take the sunshine without having to endure or explain or describe or own a piece of the thunderstorms, then what is America beyond a fallacy if we're not going to be honest? I would imagine that an honest nation would say, do you see how far we've come? Yes, we did this. We're going to own every single part of that. But we also delivered this freedom. We also fought a war to abolish this, that you would take both. And I think in this denial, it's part of a very old playbook. And we saw that with the Daughters of the Confederacy, trying to, in the lost cause, and taking control of libraries and school boards and banning books to make sure that certain aspects of this society are shown positively and others are negative. And so it's unfortunate that we continue to experience this kind of thing on a loop, but this is America's baseline.
Trymaine Lee, A Thousand Ways to Die comes out tomorrow. Congratulations. Everyone get your copy, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So New York City mayoral frontrunner Zohran Mamdani's government-run grocery store plan is coming under fire. We're going to discuss that next. We'll be right back.